I also want to say how nice it is to get back into Canton to see some of the friends that we've made over these past years. Even friends that I'd never met until today, like Laurel Krause. So it's really an interesting experience. 40 years is a very long time. For most of these Kent anniversaries, my mom would be up here talking to you while I would sit anonymously out there on the grass. This year, my mom and I had a talk, and we decided that it is now my turn. So my mom is back in New York City, and my kids, Jeff and Jamie, are here somewhere. And they're now grown up and married, and their wives and husbands are here. Danny and John are somewhere there too. It feels odd, but kind of nice to be afforded the chance to talk about my brother after all these years. So for that, I thank you. I was 3 years older. I was 19 and a junior at Michigan State, and I remember Jeff came out, and thank God the wind isn't too bad, to spend a week with me at school. At that point, Jeff was just a kid looking to follow in his older brother's footsteps. And he did, starting at Michigan State in 1967. The background to this is that there was a lot happening during this time. The Vietnam War was heating up, and Jeff was developing his own identity. By the time 1970 came around, I was back in New York City starting my career, and Jeff had become much more acutely aware of the war and opinionated about its justification. Michigan State had come to symbolize a life that Jeff now wanted to reject. So in January of that year, he transferred to Kent. From afar, he and I had a lot to talk about the war. That war, more than the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts of today, fully absorbed America. For a young 20-something, there was an immediacy because once we graduated, the likelihood of being drafted would become very high. Who was Jeff? First of all, he was bright. He skipped a grade in elementary school, and he scored very high in his SATs. He was a drummer in a band and a DJ on the local campus radio station. On the air, his nickname was Short Mort, because he was only 5'6". I remember talking to him about what we would do when the inevitable draft notice arrived. By 1970, I was accepting that if I were to be drafted, I would go. Jeff, on the other hand, was far more idealistic and passionate. He told me that he was willing to sacrifice everything and head to Canada if he was forced to choose. It was a time when he and I, who had always been extremely close, were constantly at odds. I remember that he came home to New York that spring break, and we double dated to a nice club in Manhattan. It was a nice, relaxing evening, and we spent some quality time. It was also the last time I saw him. I remember that first week in May. Back in New York, we heard via TV about all the craziness that was going on. We knew Jeff would be involved, but we also knew that he would never do anything malicious. Jeff would call my mom each night to give her the straight scoop and to assure her that he was okay. I remember not feeling too much concern until we heard about the buildings being torched, but Jeff called that night to assure my mom that he was fine. My own link to Kent began the evening of May 4th. I remember going to my grandmother's house in the Bronx for dinner, oblivious to the events of the day. I got there during the 6 o'clock news, just when the first pictures were being aired. Fortunately, while we heard that students were shot, they hadn't yet released any names. I remember my grandmother asking if I thought Jeff would have been there, and I told her there was no doubt about it. But I also remember not feeling overly concerned because I knew Jeff was smart enough to keep his head down. I later learned that my mom heard the news the hard way. She called Jeff's room, and one of his roommates just gave it to her very matter-of-factly. At that point, her main thought was to get to my grandmother and I to break the news to us as gently as possible. My aunt was given that task to drive over to the Bronx to tell us before we heard it on TV. Fortunately, she got there just in time. They did begin saying the victims' names later that evening. The next few days were very chaotic. I remember the funeral in New York City, driving up Broadway in Manhattan with 100,000 people lining the streets, hanging out windows, flashing the peace sign, and touching the windows of the car as we drove by. A few days later, there was a huge rally in Washington, D.C. I remember getting a call from Ted Kennedy's office inviting me down to meet him and to speak at that rally. A woman from Life magazine flew with me. How strange it was to meet Senator Kennedy in his office and then to speak in front of so many thousands of people. Now, 40 years later, the events sort of run together. The next thing I remember is coming home to my mom's house in New York, getting off the bus and seeing a limo parked in front of my mom's apartment. All the neighbors sitting outside on the steps. I had no clue what was going on, but clearly something was going on. I remember walking into my mom's apartment with all these eyes fixed upon me. And inside, my mom was sitting on the couch with Nelson Rockefeller. He was the governor of New York at that time and eventually became a vice president. So I plopped myself down on the floor, and for the next few hours we schmoozed. I told him about my adventure in D.C., and the governor talked about his mission to clean up the drug problems that had become prevalent at that time. It was very fun getting to know him, partly because he was one of those guys who's larger than life. What a great guy he was, even if he was a Republican. From a personal perspective, there are so many memories. Some are awful, and some are good. The trick is to remember them all with focus on the good. Like everything else in life, there's bad, but there's also good, and we need to focus on the good. In closing, I want to say thanks to the university for inviting my family and I out here today, and a special thanks to Alan Canfora for his constant presence over these years.